Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to an ESOP Centre FS Club webinar with me, Ian Harris. I'm be your chairman today, and I'm very delighted to be hosting David Craddock, who's a founder director of David Craddock Consultancy Services. That's me, Ian Harris, managing director of the Zien Group. And we're here thanks to the ESOP Centre and its members. This slide shows the members of the ESOP Centre, and it is through their membership and sponsorship that we are able to have this webinar programme for you. The ESOP Centre is part of the FS Club that Zien Group runs, and these are the members and sponsors of the FS Club, and we are equally grateful to the generosity of the sponsorship and membership of FS Club members to enable us to have a very wide-ranging seminar programme, of which the ESOP Centre area and this particular series of webinars is part. Very simple agenda for this afternoon. I'm giving an introduction. I hope it will be fewer than the 5 minutes that are showing, and then our keynote speaker David Craddock will speak for about 20 minutes, after which we will have a 20-minute or so question and answer session. We do think that today's subject matter is quite discursive and should raise plenty of questions and answers, so please do chip those questions into us. You will find on your panel a questions box that will enable you to submit your questions. Please submit your questions through the GoToWebinar question panel. It's always lovely to receive emails and messages from people in other ways, but while we're on this webinar, we don't see any of those things. We only see the questions panel within GoToWebinar. So please submit your questions that way. The other thing that I want to say, because I know that there are quite a few attendees for this rather discursive topic who are not regulars for David's webinar program with the ESOP Centre here. All of the slides and materials that David will be talking through will be available on the Zien website for you to download and read through at your leisure. And I emphasize that point particularly with today's webinar in mind. It's quite a meaty topic. David's written some wonderful detailed notes that I think many people will find it interesting to read after the webinar, but he's going to whiz through those topics really just to give us a sort of tour d'horizon of his thoughts on the impact of inflation on share schemes, and to leave us room for some meaty discussion afterwards. So as I say, today's speaker is David Craddock. He's the founder director of David Craddock Consultancy Services, and he really is an expert on his topic. He has written the Totally Guide to employee share ownership schemes, which is the sort of standard textbook on the topic, and it is always a pleasure to host him here at the FS Club and ESOP Centre. You will find in your slide pack details of how to get in touch with David on a slide that looks a bit like this and a slide that looks a bit like this. But without further ado, I would like to hand over to David and let David talk you through this fascinating topic, share schemes and the impact of inflation. David.
Well, thank you, Ian. And as Ian has already indicated, I've provided copious notes for you here. I always take the view that you come to these seminars, webinars to learn, and therefore I want to pack the half hour with as much information as possible. I don't intend to focus on every detail on the slides. I will intend to expound on the key principles, but you then have a resource to go back to and read in detail. And if you want to come back to me with any further questions, do feel able to. There won't be any problem whatsoever in contacting me through the contact details on the presentation. So this really is the subject of the moment. It's top of the agenda on every newsreel, and I'm talking, of course, about the cost of living, the very harmful effects that inflation has on everyday lives. It's fully justified that the newsreel should put it top of the agenda. After all, we do live in a democracy, and this subject is affecting people in in very, very difficult circumstances that become more difficult by the day. Recognize that inflation is the equivalent of a regressive tax, but by that I mean that it affects poorer people more than it affects wealthier people. Somebody to the point where they reach a point of deciding between either eating or heating. The resort of many will be to go into hard-earned savings in the first instance. If that doesn't carry them through, then they'll probably take out debt. If debt isn't available, then they'll go into arrears. And the mental trauma which can follow from that is just so difficult to estimate for any given individual. But it has the propensity to lead to homelessness, to mental trauma, to hospitalization. It really is that serious. Inflation is also very uneven in its effect, not just between poorer and wealthier people, but also between people who work in the public sector, people who work in the private sector. Where in the private sector, company employees will typically award higher wage rate increases than government bodies do. But by contrast to the plight of poorer people for the wealthier, well, capital values rise with inflation. The debt taken out by the wealthy to fund capital projects typically reduces in value. So you can see how disproportionate is the effect of inflation on people's cost of living, and it really is a regressive tax in all sorts of ways. So furthermore, then, we have the conundrum as to how to cure the UK economy from the impact of inflation, which is compounded by the fact that we've got impact on costs of food, costs of fuel, costs of gas and electricity. What about initially then the response of the Bank of England? How do we approach this conundrum? Well, the Bank of England clearly responded last week with an increase in the bank rate from 1% to 1.25%, presumably following the example set by the US Fed the day before to increase its rate by 0.75%. Remember that the target inflation rate that the Bank of England has for the rate of inflation is 2%. We need some inflation in the economy to keep the economy buoyant and indeed to avoid the recession-inducing effects of inflation. But do bear in mind that it's very difficult for the Bank of England, the Monetary Committee, to make these decisions. I guess really last week probably the main concern was to raise the bank rate so as to attract buyers for sterling, therefore stabilize the exchange rate and reduce the cost of imports and therefore imported inflation. The converse of that, though, the downside of that is that it increases the cost of exports and therefore stifles any growth-led recovery. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Ian. So the inevitable question is to ask, are we witnessing a repeat of the 1970s when inflation in the UK reached 25%, interest rates during the time of Margaret Thatcher reached 17% in valiant attempts to break the inflationary price wage spiral? That was a time when inflation took hold of the nation and expectations ran completely out of control. And if there's one lesson that we need to learn from the 1970s, it is that we need to manage expectations. A big onus there, of course, is upon the leading decision takers within the country, the banks, government, company employers, and also trade union leaders. For the government to pursue a responsible fiscal policy, for the Bank of England a responsible monetary policy, for the management of industrial relations by company employers, and indeed for the trade unions to actually exercise restraint. The difference, of course, from the 1970s is that the UK economy at this current time is actually slowing down, and we do actually have a projected growth for the year 2022 of 0%, in which case the slowdown might actually do the job that massive hikes in interest rates would otherwise be asked to do, and indeed were asked to do, in the 1970s. The point is that somehow inflation has to be squeezed out of the economy and the economy actually cured of this malaise. Let's go to the next slide. So the dangers of stagflation. This word stagflation comes from a combination of the first four words of the word first four letters of the word stagnant, S-T-A-G, and the final seven letters of the word inflation, F-A-L-T-I-O-N. stagflation. Ultimately, the danger is that inflation, if left unchecked, will reduce demand in the economy. It might be created initially through demand pull, but ultimately it will lead to reduced demand in the economy through lower purchasing power, with a consequential downward spiral of the nation's economy into recession. And that's when, for a period, the danger is that we would have high inflation with a stagnant economy. The hidden danger in 2022 is that successive increases in interest rates, should they be the policy that is adopted by the Bank of England, may actually not reduce inflation. They may not actually succeed in their objective. Why? Well, the answer to is that the conditions that have created inflation this time around remain, in the main, unaffected by monetary policy. What are they? Well, massive increase in the money supply to fund COVID-19, and that money is still in the economy, swirling around with different levels of velocity of circulation of that money, depending upon what time period you choose to examine. Food shortages through the war in Ukraine, how are they going to be affected or corrected by increases in interest rates? Restrictions in the supply of fossil-based fuel supplies through the resolve to combat climate change, very necessary to combat climate change, but clearly it's got to be done in a responsible way and with an appropriate timescale. And then the supply chain bottlenecks in China. Would interest rate hikes really do anything for the alleviation of those bottlenecks? No, I don't think so. And then, of course, the shortage of labour, which is a residue characteristic of the pandemic period, where people examined their lifestyles and decided they wanted to work less. A really major problem on work ethic for the coming years within the UK economy. So that's the danger, that we end up with stagflation, stagnant growth, combined with rampant inflation. We have to find a path out of that. We have to find a path which avoids getting into stagnation, and therefore we need to navigate that path very carefully indeed. I've headed this slide, the economic evolution from the 2000s to the present day. I remember back in 2006 interviewing a former cabinet minister who'd served under the John Major regime, and he was very, very keen to point out to me that he believed that the days of high inflation were over. Through globalisation, he contended, we could access lower prices for food supplies, for pharmaceuticals, for component parts from parts of the world which didn't demand high pay, and therefore there wasn't the cost plus inflation, which is often such a major element in igniting inflation within economy. And there was ample supply of oil and gas, he contended, and so problem solved. The realization slowly dawned upon the Western nations that not all supply chains could be entrusted, particularly when they were from non-democratic nations that were not natural geopolitical allies. And so we find all this coming to a hiatus, with the pandemic emanating from China in 2020, and the war in Ukraine arising from completely unprovoked aggression from Russia in 2022. So recognize that even before those events, even before the pandemic, the process of deglobalization had begun. Though prior to the pandemic, what we were finding was that globalization was giving way to regionalization. The world was being split up into economic regions, and of course the UK went to the far extreme and established its own region, namely the UK itself, alone through Brexit. But what has come together at the same time now are two key factors. The response to COVID-19 by the British government, and the British government wasn't the only government to take this action, was to inject a massive increase into the money supply, creating excessive liquidity in the market. That money swirls around, it increases the velocity of circulation to create more and more transactions, and that causes an upward pull on prices through demand pull inflation. But at the same time, this is where we've got the problem compounded and why it's so severe. We have at the same time a contraction in the supply of goods and services from what we previously thought were very reliable sources of supply. And that has a consequential impact on productivity at home and overseas. There's one further point as well to note in relation to the money supply. You might say, well, there was a massive injection of money into the economy in 2008, 2009, following the banking crisis, the financial crisis, the great financial crisis, as they say. Well, yes, there was, but the money went straight into the banks, shored up the banks' balance sheets, and stayed there. The difference this time is it goes directly into people's pocket, swirls around the economy, and creates ever-increasing demand through the velocity of circulation of money. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Ian. So just let's canter through this slide very quickly. Summary position on the causes of the current cost of living crisis. By the way, I do have solutions. It's not all doom, this presentation. But on this slide, let's just look at the causes. The printing of money through a distorted form of quantitative easing that devalues the currency. If you create more of anything, it devalues it. And that's clearly the case in the situation where there's an increase in the supply of money. At the same time as it's creating demand pull inflation. The reduction in the supply of energy with the impact on cost plus inflation and supply restriction that creates supply chain bottlenecks. The developed historical dependence for supplier nations that are neither at root either natural friends to the West, nor indeed friends of the tradition of representative government. In the US, of course, you have this curious phenomenon of the flooding of the US with illegal immigrants, and we're talking about millions coming over the southern border, which loosens the labour market, it lowers wages, and therefore it undermines purchasing power for Americans. We don't quite have that problem to that degree in the UK to create that massive economic effect, but we do have the problem nevertheless of illegal immigration. 5 is the pursuit of the green agenda, a very, very worthy cause indeed. Of course it is, an absolutely necessary pursuit. Of course it is, but it requires a balanced introduction rather than an all or nothing approach. And indeed, it's the all which is currently being performed by the Western economies, particularly in the United States. 6 is the lockdowns, the curfews, the stay-at-home orders that pay people not to work. Well, that reduces the supply of labour, contributing to demand pull inflation at a lower level of productivity. So you've got lots of money swirling around, enabling demand to increase and increase at the same time as production is falling. Not a great position to be in. And so 7 is the pent-up demand during the pandemic combined with the cash build-up during the pandemic, all coming to a head as the country opens up again. It creates an unusually high demand for goods and services, all at the same time, all compounding the problems of inflation. And then 8, do recognise the fact that the American and the Chinese economies are so large that we can't look at the UK economy in isolation. Recognise that we have imported inflation from the US, both of the demand pull type and the cost push type, and B, supply scarcity from China with the consequential impact on supply restrictions. They're factors which require insulation for the UK economy that can only be achieved through our own developing self-sufficiency. More of that later. Next slide, please, Ian. Thank you. So, where are we now? The unique features and characteristics of stocks and shares. So we're going to come on to share schemes in just a few moments, but I want to say a few words initially about the commodity which lies at the very heart of the stocks and shares themselves. An employee share scheme is, of course, an arrangement which links an employee incentive to the growth in the share value of a company, to the growth in what we call the share price. A concept that is predicated on the properties and the characteristics that are embodied in the share. To look at philosophically what a share is, fundamentally, the share will capture value that's generated as a result of genuine human endeavour and purpose. So we might look at a share and say, look, this is a financial measurement of a company. Well, it is, of course it is. But what's gone into creating that share value? Human effort, human endeavour, human purpose. The testimony of economic history is that the shares of a company whose underlying foundations are strong will ultimately rise in value. Ultimately, they will rise in value and deliver gains. So how very short-sighted it is to take the view that cash holdings, subject to, say, a permanent 9% inflation erosion represent a hedge against, say, a temporary 20% reduction in share values. That 9% inflation erosion on cash will never come back. But the temporary 20% reduction in share values, if you're working with a company in which you have confidence, you know that the underlying foundations are strong, it will come back. Of course it will. Volatility in varying degrees of severity is part of the behavior of how stocks and shares work. We just have to accept that. They're tossed around on stormy seas. But if the ship is built of sturdy material, then, well, in time, once again, it'll find a safe harbor. It'll come home laden with goodies, laden with dividends, with capital gains, with those who put the faith in the mission, the faith in the stocks and shares. So the way to hedge, therefore, is the other way around. Not to take up cash to prevent losses on shares. Is to actually work with a carefully chosen portfolio of stocks and shares in a hedge, longer term, against the vicissitudes of inflation with its effects on cash. That's the way to do it. Remember, of course, that this thinking is a thinking which you need to apply as both an investor and as an employee. And so we come on to employee share schemes. Let's go to the next slide. The blueprint for the path to recovery for the UK economy. Well, the path to recovery is first to recognise that inflation is a symptom. It's the most aggressive symptom of the deeper underlying malaise of deficiencies in productivity and supply. Very, very important indeed. You know, I see these debates on television, UK television, US television, and they focus all the time on inflation and its causes and its effects, but rarely do they recognise that inflation is simply a symptom of a deeper malaise. Yeah, there's a fascinating piece in The Economist, not just this last week, but the week before, about the underlying malaise of productivity and how that's what really needs to be addressed in all the Western economies, quite frankly. The credible and meaningful approach to recovery, then, that is consistent with how the human spirit works, is to combine the following two approaches: lowering taxes with the effect of increasing private investment and therefore releasing growth potential in the economy, and at the same time increasing wages. Increasing wages, you say, well, doesn't that have the effect of contributing to cost plus inflation? Well, not if it's in line with productivity. And that's what employee share schemes enables. It enables wages to rise, but in line with productivity. Pay rises and business awards only after the productivity has been achieved and not before. In the execution of the latter, employee share schemes makes a unique contribution. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Ian. So we're on to employee share schemes at last. The unique contribution of employee share schemes on the productivity, pay, and price metrics. So the unique contribution that share schemes have to play is in facilitating business reward for employees through matching wages or pay increases, if you like, with productivity, rewarding productivity once it's been achieved, after there is evidence of the achievement and not before. And surely that isn't that good business practice? You know, in my own business, I don't bill people until work has been completed, or I might complete stage payments. But you know, I'm not billing before the work has been done. Well, that's how we should work in an employment situation with a company, that we should actually award the pay increases to match the productivity once the productivity has been achieved. The point then is this: one, wages then create demand in the economy while the productivity creates the supply, and that's how the matching occurs. The principle has to be applied at the macroeconomic level of individual companies in each individual company. Can we go back, Ian, to that previous slide? We've not got through that yet. Okay, yeah. And then to be extrapolated to the macroeconomic level, to the economy as a whole. And in that context, employee share schemes assumes a management role within national economies. Louis Kelso was the foremost employee share schemes lawyer of all time, and he talked about the wages of capital. And so his vision was for employees to be rewarded after the productivity has been achieved, but not just through pay, but through the wages of capital. What are the wages of capital? The wages of capital are the return on capital, which are dividends, profit share, and capital gains. And just a final point on that slide, employee share schemes is this wonderful arrangement which delivers individual reward for team performance, and so it fosters very, very healthy and good industrial relations, and with that productivity increases, and so the employees through their employee share scheme come into a deeper understanding of how businesses work, and most importantly, they reap the rewards of the wages of capital to pay for goods and services at prices that are commensurate with the productivity and the pay outcomes. So that's the contribution of share schemes to productivity, pay, and prices. But what about the contribution to self-sufficiency and self-regulation? Well, the major concern, of course, at the moment is the dependence upon overseas sources of supply. And if we can reduce the dependence on overseas sources of supply, well, the only way to do is to increase our own productivity, and that creates our own self-sufficiency. So you see the way in which that causal trail works, from the introduction of an employee share scheme to increase productivity, to establish our own supply chains, and therefore our own self-sufficiency. Let's go to the next slide. Actually, let's just go back to that previous one. We've got a few moments there. The previous one, please, Ian. Yeah, because I mentioned Louis Kelso on the last but one slide, the foremost employee share schemes economist of all time. But Martin Weitzman, Professor Martin Weitzman, made a very, very powerful contribution to his book, The Share Economy. And in that book, he talked very, very robustly about how working with a core pay, and on top of that a variable pay, the variable pay would vary with the performance of the company. So individuals became used to the core pay, but working hard to increase the variable pay. But if productivity didn't arise or arose in less amounts than previously, then the variable pay would fall. And so you have with that model, you have fluctuating levels of income, and with it less severity in smoothing out the booms and the troughs in the trade cycle, and therefore not requiring heavy monetary stimulus which has inflationary effect in order to reignite the economy. So you can see how that variable pay will consist of a combination of profit share and indeed dividends and capital gains, the full range of the wages of capital, as well as normal pay. So you can see how employee share schemes can offer a very, very powerful set of principles in order to create a non-inflationary environment. This last slide then, talking about the share schemes, or the share plans as we sometimes refer to them, how should they be managed? How should we approach them in this current era? Okay, for existing discretionary employee share option schemes, the message to the employees is sit tight. If you believe in your company, if you've got confidence in your company, have confidence in the underlying strengths of the company, you'll have confidence in the capacity of its share to grow in value. So keep confidence in your own contribution, keep the vision, keep the dream, and look forward individually and as a team to reward. Sit tight on those discretionary share option schemes. What about the savings-related share option scheme? Well, that requires cash. If people are struggling, it could be that they're compromised on making the payments. But if you possibly can, if you can afford, keep going with them with the same mentality as I've explained in relation to the discretionary schemes. The message for the companies, of course, is to keep the employee communication strong. There's a whole piece in my book, Ties Guide to Employee Share Schemes, where I talk about how to, it's for management really, how to cope with a fall in the share price, managing expectations where there's a downturn. A very, very sensitive set of communications, and I give guidance in that work to how management can deal with that effectively. And then for the free shares employee share schemes, well, look, this is the era for free shares, but free shares in return for performance and productivity. Yeah, shares as an alternative to cash, thereby preserving cash for companies as profit margins tighten and as cash is applied to putting into place alternative supply chains through either vertical integration, which will require money to do, or alternatively entering into partnership with other UK-based third-party providers. Okay, that's a quick run through my presentation on share schemes and the impact of inflation. I've sought to show how employee share schemes offer a solution, and a solution that governments need to consider. I'm open to questions. Bring them on. all comers. Thank you very much, Ian.
David, thank you very much indeed for whizzing us through that fascinating topic. We have several questions submitted. We've probably got room for one or two more if people have been so engaged in what you were saying they haven't yet managed to write in their questions. I would like to actually start with a question of my own, which is really about the motivation of the individual employees, and you touched on it towards the end of the talk. You've spent most of your time talking about how governments might react to inflation and how the corporates might react to it. And I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of the individual employee who is trying to balance their personal portfolio. And that balancing might not just be about cash and shares, but it might be a balance between cash, shares within their own company share scheme, and the extent to which they're going to make contributions to ISAs and pensions and all of that other stuff. And I just wonder what effect it has on people. My own experience of it, with, if you like, my own company share scheme, was very much linked to your point about confidence, which is I had confidence in what we were doing, and at the stage of my career where I needed to trade off those thoughts, I was thinking, no, I really want to invest in what I'm doing and what I can control. But if it's a larger company and it's more about believing in what the company is doing in general, and trading those things off. Any thoughts about the individual perspective on these things? Clearly, you come at it from the point of view of I'm helping companies to put schemes together, go sell it. But from the point of view of an individual, what extent should I be majoring on this?
I think the individual is in the best position is the individual who's got confidence, not just in the company and therefore the long-term prospects for the share, but also confidence in the management, and that there is an active employee communications relationship with management. That piece that I think I first presented to the National Centre for Employee Ownership in San Francisco about 15 or so years ago, coping with downturn in the share price. It's in my book. That is a whole set of principles that management need to follow to work with employees, to keep them buoyant, to keep them confident, to keep them optimistic, and recognise that this is a short-term phenomenon and this company has long-term prospects. For the individuals themselves, clearly they need to think very carefully about their investment portfolio. What I can say for my own position is that I'm still putting money into the market. I put money into the market every month. I'm not planning to not put money into the market. My money is managed by not just one fund manager, but something like 8 or 9 different fund managers. So I've diversified. But recognise also, you see, that when prices go down within a fund, well, the smart fund manager will see the trend and sell within the fund before the price falls, and then they'll buy again at the bottom of the market in anticipation of the price rising again. The other factor, of course, is that when you're putting money in every month, you're benefiting from what's called pound cost averaging, and in the States they call it dollar cost averaging, where you're buying at different prices, and so you're benefiting from that fund manager approach of selling at the top and then buying at the bottom, and recognizing, that there is enormous volatility in the market currently. Again, I've got a piece on volatility. I think it's on my website that you might want to see, and I've developed that thinking to a very high level. Made many presentations all over the world about it. Volatility, don't get frightened by volatility. Volatility is a characteristic of how stocks and shares work. Recognize that that's just a fact of life, but the longer term prospect, if you're working with really good quality stocks, is that over the long term the markets rise. Okay, so that would be the thinking that I'd want to instill in an employee. A whole collection of thoughts there, Ian. I don't really want to pick any of them up and ask me to develop them further.
I'm going to let Matt Bradbury from Armstrong's do the follow-up questions, because they've been coming in while you were answering my question. It's a sort of two-part question. I'll put both parts to you, and thank you for this, Matt. This is intriguing. How much would you say to that an employer should put into an employee share scheme a month from their basic wage? Is it, you know, can you come up with a percentage such as 20%? And as a follow-up question, as an individual with stocks and shares ISAs, do you think that people should be thinking that there's a £20,000 tax-free amount that they can put in each year? Should they be looking at that ahead of anything that they're putting into the employee share scheme, or should they be balancing off between these things? I think the same would probably apply in the UK to pension contributions as well, if they're
yeah. So a diversified portfolio is always the way to approach investment. Don't put all your eggs in the one basket. A diversified portfolio, a portfolio for anybody who is actively interested in investment. In my view, at as early an age as possible, they should start making contributions every month. You know, when I started work, my very first job, my mother waltzed me off to the local town to meet a representative from a very highly renowned investment company, and investment started. She absolutely instilled it in me, and she did the same with my brother, and you know, we sort of pass it down through the generations. So start saving as early as you possibly can. But no, you should think in terms of building pension for one. Okay, in credible, strong funds. That's one, and aim for a particular level, you know, for 30, 40 years hence, whatever it might be. Secondly, you should think in terms at some stage of investing in property. Despite what appear to be constant attempts by government to undermine the returns on property investment, it is a very, very sound investment, both as a capital investment and as an investment which has the propensity to deliver income through rents. And then thirdly, a collection of standalone funds or standalone one-off stock investments. And over my career, and still, that is the approach which I've sought to take. The point about how much should you put into the employee share scheme, if you believe in that company, and you're offered an opportunity to say through a same-related share option scheme, then put in as much as your budget allows, up to the maximum per month, if you can possibly afford it. You're never going to lose the cash, even if the stock price falls. That's how the same-related save as you earn scheme works. That there is a cash parachute. But look, you know, if you believe in the company, that's the key principle. Do you believe and have confidence that share value is going to rise over the longer term? Point which Ian mentioned earlier, just to tie in with Matt's point, if you're actually in a company, whether it be a private company or a quoted company, you can see how it operates. You know, and I would say that a decision I took some years back, having worked for as a consultant, as well as my UK work for a number of companies in the States, and particularly in California, I saw how those companies operated. I mean, boy, was I impressed with their management training, with their organization, with their goal setting, with their manager-employee relationships. And I thought, I want to invest in these companies. And so I said to my financial advisor, who acts as the intermediary between me and the fund managers, I said, Jeff, I want to get into these American funds. And so we structured a very large proportion of my funds in American companies. I've still got British companies. I've got investment in companies all over the world. But the biggest emphasis is upon those wealth creating giants in the US, and in particular in California and Texas, in fact.
Thank you. In fact, we have a couple of questions actually that are coming in, I believe, from America. So Susan asked the question. I'm going to give you 1 minute to answer what I think could be a 1 hour exam question, an economics degree or master's level question.
So yeah, far away.
Please expand on what you mean by the velocity of circulation of money. And I'll park that one in your head
Okay.
and ask her follow-up question.
Yeah.
I'll put the two together, or they're not entirely related. Do you think that your remarks only apply to the United Kingdom, or would they be equally applicable or very much applicable in the United States as well as in the United Kingdom?
Two very good questions. Okay, let's go for velocity of circulation first. I've had a couple of minutes for it to distill.
You've got 1 minute.
Yeah, okay. Well, velocity of circulation is a concept which relates to the rate at which money circulates in the economy. It gained prominence in the 1970s when the work of Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, and the quantity theory of money gained prominence. And essentially what it says is that the more that money circulates, the more transactions are going to take place, and with more individuals wanting to engage in more transactions through a greater rate at which the money circulates, it's going to push inflation up through demand pull inflation. So in 1 minute, have I done well, Larry? In 1 minute, that's the velocity of circulation.
You've done great. I would just add to it that at the moment we have a problem that links the supply side issues that you talked about with that demand pull, simply because people weren't able to spend their money during the pandemic, and there seems to be and now I want to spend it effect amongst those people who have money, which is probably delivering some, but my guess is the smaller part of the inflation. So my guess is it's primarily supply side at the moment, but we have in addition got this demand pull extra velocity of money, which is probably short term. The supply side problem could take many years to resolve if we're talking about stuff that's linked to war.
I think you're right. You know, I mean, there is pent-up demand. It's in my presentation. The fact that people sat on those cash reserves throughout the pandemic, and then zoom, they're ready to spend, and boy, are they spending. The supply side of the equation, yes, very serious, and it takes the form in different manifestations. So you've got the bottlenecks of goods which once came out of China and Taiwan, not coming out of China and Taiwan anymore as a consequence of the pandemic restrictions. You've also, of course, got supply side problems on labour, people not wanting to work, wanting a change of lifestyle. Let's just now pivot onto her second question, which I think was about the comparison between the UK and the US.
In US.
One of the major differences between the UK and the US is the policies which are being pursued by the respective governments. On our government side, led by Prime Minister Johnson, he's had his troubles and so forth, but I noted, I think it was the 9th of June, his Blackpool speech, he talked very openly about wanting to pursue a high productivity economy with low taxes. Low taxes was, of course, the way that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher got inflation cured. Very interesting debate to have there. At that time, there was symmetry between a Reagan approach in the US and the Thatcher approach in the UK. Not anymore. The US are pursuing a program which I believe is the wrong program to follow, which is to try and spend their way out of inflation. I mean, for goodness sake, really, can you credit it that they believe that inflation can be quelled by encouraging more spending? No, it can't. There's also the problem, of course, of the southern border. We have our own immigration problems here, and there's the Rwanda program, which has fallen on pretty difficult territory. But in the States, they have the enormous problem of the opening up of the southern border since the beginning of this new Biden administration. And what that means, of course, I mean, whether you like Trump or loathe Trump, what you can say for him is that he pursued two policies which were very effective. One was to have a tight labour market, which kept wages high, which kept people's purchasing power, which therefore kept the unions, which are very strong in the US, very happy. And also he had a strong energy policy based on energy sufficiency. Well, the Biden government reversed that energy sufficiency policy, and it also reversed the immigration policy. Now bringing lots of people into the US, it means that cheap labour is available, so wages fall, purchasing power falls, unions conversely become very unhappy, and so you've got a supply side problem on the on the labour front. We have our own labour shortage problems. That is a similarity between the UK and the US, but the severity of it in the US is so much more powerful. Does that give you some insight? I think we've probably got a few more questions. I want to be fair with people and make sure I can answer theirs as well. Yeah, great questions.
That's fine. Intriguingly, Con Keating, who I think has just gone, has chimed in to say he believes the velocity of money is falling, so he doesn't think that this is.
That's not true, actually. That is not true.
The economics of it. And I think there's a timing issue around the stats that you're looking at and what has happened to David. It's an intriguing topic about which we could talk forever, but we're not going to talk forever about it. What we're going to do,
issue where ultimately in the cycle it always turns. We may have reached that point as the answer to the question. So maybe I do agree with him. Yeah.
I do, and I would agree with that. It's time to do the thank yous, and I'm going to do the thank yous in this order. I'm going to thank once again the FS Club for sponsoring us and enabling us to have this type of presentation and discussion. Similarly, the ESOP Centre and all of the members of the ESOP Centre here. We are very grateful to you all for your membership, your sponsorship, and your forbearance on all of these topics. It's wonderful to be able to cover the breadth of the topic and not just the specific technical issues around employee share ownership. We're grateful to you for that. Just before I do my final thank yous, I just want to remind everybody there are a lot of resources around both the ESOP Centre and FS Club that are available to you on the ZN website, the FS Club part of the ZN website. So you have newspad for the ESOP Centre and bulletins around all manner of topics, including employee share ownership. This is also part of a wide-ranging webinar program about which I just put up a slide showing the next few that are coming up. So we've got a talk next week on carbon emission accounts and data sets for global corporates on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, the missing link in sanctions screening, which will be very interesting for those who are interested in that type of thing. And on Tuesday, the 5th of July, an update on EU financial services legislation and initiatives around that. And then for those of you who like really wide-ranging discussion, on Tuesday, the 12th of July, what does it really mean to be a purpose-driven company? And on Tuesday, the 19th of July, when it really starts raining, you need more than an ark. Fascinating. So thank you to you, the audience, for coming along, for chipping in with your questions, and for sticking around, which almost all of you have done, which is wonderful. And so that just leaves me really to thank David for his time and efforts with this talk. Once again, David, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you. If we were doing these things live and in a room, there would be a resounding round of applause. We can't do that, but instead I thought a little sort of Tibetan bell. People get the absolutely wonderful sort of vibratory sound that comes from ringing that bell to thank you instead. David, always a pleasure to host you. Thank you for coming. Thank you again to the audience. And we will see you all again very soon, I hope. Goodbye.
Thank you, audience. Thank you.